Hello, we have a question for you. My name is Gwendolyn Scott, and before we start this webinar, the question John Fischer has for you is, what kind of fruit do you grow? And will you please put your answers in the chat so we can see them? Anybody? We're all growing fruit. Welcome. So, what kind of fruit do you grow? Ooh, Juliet grows apples, pears, blueberries, and plums. Apples, pears, blueberries, plums. Shirley grows a new fruit called goji berry. Tyler grows blueberries, tomatoes, raspberries, and strawberries. Brenda grows cherries, apples, plums, and raspberries, gooseberries. Ooh la la. I myself grow, and I grow figs, raspberries, 2 types of pears, 2 types of plums, and raspberries, if I can always say that, but figs and raspberries, and tomatoes, of course. So we have all sorts. Oh, and then apples, pears, hardy, kiwis, so that's Bonnie Houston. Oh, good Bonnie. Kiwis have yet to produce. Okay, John, you're on. Anybody else? Any other questions? Okay, I'm going to do my lovely introduction. Well, thank you, and we're going to start this webinar. Hello, everyone. My name is Gwendolyn Scott. I'm a member of the OSU Lane County Master Gardener Association. I want to welcome you to our Saturday summer celebration virtual event. This afternoon, we will have 3 different talks. One on carefree fruit and cover crops, one on food preservation and safety, and one on propagating your garden plants. All of these talks will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel. Questions will be handled at the end of each talk. Please put your questions in the Q&A. That way we can find them. And Helen Jackson, another Lane County Master Gardener, will coordinate the Q&A talks. Are you ready, John?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, there you go. Please share.
That's what I'm doing. So I'm going to talk about fruit that you can grow, and I thought it was interesting to see what different people grow. And among the things that I like to point out in this presentation is that there's a lot of things you can grow here that people don't in general, and a larger number of them don't have a lot of problems. So when I talk about trying to make it go to the next slide, it'll take us a second to figure it out. Oh, I'm sorry, Gwendolyn. I'm going to stop share for a second because it's not advancing.
John, hello.
Yeah.
Do you have arrows down by your keyboard?
Yeah.
Use those.
Okay.
So screen share. And now try using your right arrow.
Yeah. Nothing.
Ugh.
So yeah, it's called technical difficulties that didn't occur when we were doing this.
There's also arrows on at the bottom of your of your PowerPoint on the bottom left, if you take your arrow and hover down a little bit lower, then you, or
Oh yeah, okay, let's
there
try
you go.
that. Cool. Okay, well, hopefully that'll work. So what I consider carefree fruit is stuff that doesn't get a lot of insect damage. I noticed a lot of people were talking about apples and pears, and they do get it. Things that don't get a lot of diseases, things that don't need you to wear a spacesuit to do the spraying and stuff, and then things that are easy to pick. If you're going to grow fruit, you really ought to grow things you like. I happen to adore figs, which are very easy to grow and have virtually no pests. But if you don't like figs, you probably shouldn't grow them. And a lot of people who have never tried a fig insist that they don't like them. The rootstock that you use will help determine how big the trees are. And as I get older, I want my trees to be shorter. So I do have some old standard apples. They're 60 feet high. They are difficult to pick. Fortunately, one or two of them have tipped over in our recent snowstorm, so they're a lot easier to pick. They're still going, but the really tiny rootstock, the dwarf rootstock, is supposed to be supported forever with 2 posts, and your tree will probably be fine unsupported until you get a big load of fruit, and it may very well tip itself over. You can tip it back up, but if you're going to use a dwarf tree, I would leave it supported forever. The sizes that they get to are somewhat flexible. You know, the dwarf tree can get bigger. The semi-dwarf trees, I have lots of them that are 25 or 30 feet tall. You can control their height, their total height, by pruning them. You're looking for well-drained soil and mold, because I would have said Oregon may not be the ideal place. There are a lot of yards that have standing water in them, and pears and apples may do okay there, but a lot of the other fruits don't want to be in standing water. But I'm starting to think that we don't live in that Oregon anymore. So there are certain locations that you need to have successful fruit. Figs and apricots, if you dare, need a sunny spot. If you try to put your fig in a cool area, you'll probably get fewer figs and more mold. Again, though, the climate seems to be changing, and my figs were more than happy everywhere. I have about 5 of them in the yard, and even the one in the north that shouldn't be there was great. Grapes need more air circulation than you might suspect. They'll get mildew more easily if they don't get air circulation. Kiwi fruit, I grow the Fuzzy Hayward. It is a huge plant, and it will get huger no matter what you do, so you need a lot of room. Apples and pears are not fussy as far as where they grow, but they do cause trouble down the line as far as getting pests. You can get a containerized tree, or you can get a bare root tree. Everything that I have, if I can, is always planted bare root because I prefer it in the spring for planting, and because if you get a tree in a container, it's possible that it was a bare root tree in the spring and that they took the roots and wrapped them up, as that picture on the right shows, and they put them into that container because they weren't able to sell it as a bare root tree. If you go to a nursery and they have a containerized tree and you want to take it out of the pot to look at it and they say, no, don't do that, you're at the wrong nursery. So feel free to take the tree out of the pot. If it's wrapped up, it may not be a loss. The one on the right there, I think it's hardly worth planting it. It's so root bound and those roots are so wrapped around it. But if you have a tree that's just somewhat stuffed in there, you can spread the roots out. And I always rinse the water, the dirt off of the tree that I'm planting, and then plant it as if it's a bare root if I have to buy a tree that's in a pot. But my preference is in the spring to do it and get bare root trees. So if you're going to plant a tree anytime, you could do this now, or you could put down, if I were going to plant a tree next spring, I would put a piece of cardboard on the ground right now, about 4 feet square, and cover it with leaves. And then next spring, you'll have dead ground. But if you're doing this in the spring, if you take off the sod, an area about twice the root size, dig a hole twice as big and deep as the bare root depth you're going to need, then you can put the sod back into the hole upside down, because you don't want to throw that sod away. If you use the cardboard to kill the grass, the nutrients are all there from the sod. If you put it in upside down, they're there, but you don't want to throw that sod away because it's really got a lot of the best part of the soil right up there in that top 6 inches. Then you can put the tree in there unamended, put the water in, and here's pictures kind of showing you the same thing. You can see in the upper left, there's the hole that I dug. The sod is out. In the next picture over to the right top, there's the sod in the hole upside down. Then I'll put the dirt back around it, give it some water, even if it's wet outside. By putting water on the tree, you'll help get the soil around the roots, and it really does a good job of getting the little micro roots well bonded to the soil. And then I put leaves over the top because it gets dried and cracked. Initially, I will stake out trees if I have the time. I don't plant any dwarfs, of course, and then I'll water it about every 2 weeks for the first summer. And this year, for the first time ever, I've watered a couple of my mature fruit trees, some of which are 70 years old, because we just have had so little rain. I don't want to lose a tree. So normally I don't water a tree after about 5 years, but this year is not normally. So now I'm going to talk about some real specific types of fruit. Plums are generally pest-free. Squirrels will get them and raccoons will get them, sure. But they come in kind of 2 types, in my opinion. You have your pre-pit plums and prunes. Prunes are a great plum because they tend to be sweeter, and they'll come a little later. Stanley is my favorite, even though I have Italian written up here. And then you have the plums that the pit is kind of stuck into the flesh, and that's no problem. They tend to be a little bit earlier. But those are kind of the 2 basics that I think about. You can get some leaf rollers into your leaves. Sometimes the fruit rots a little bit, sure, but the solutions are pretty simple. You really don't need to worry about a few leaves being rolled up on a plum tree. You could use Safer's soap. I tend to take away the rotten fruit with this mistaken vision that that will keep those spores from spreading and I'll never have rotten fruit again. Of course, that turns out not to be true, but the plums tend to be pretty much worry-free and they don't get worms or anything of that sort. Figs are the crop that I mentioned earlier that is just an amazing thing that grows here. It's the sweetest thing that you're going to be able to grow in Oregon. You'll get more sugar out of it than anything else. And there are 2 kinds of figs, basically. There's 2 crop figs, like Peter's Honey, which will give you usually a small crop in the spring of big figs. And you'll get this huge crop, hundreds and hundreds of fall figs. And if you have done, as I suggest, and planted them in a sunny location, in a south-facing location, most of those, or many of them, will get ripe, and they'll just keep ripening until the fall rains really set in. So last year, we ate figs into November from the 2-crop fig. The Desert King and others are single crop figs, and if you have a cooler location or a little less sunshine, you're more likely to get a crop if you use a 1-crop fig. But because figs are pretty easy to prune and they're beautiful trees with lovely lush foliage, I would at least put in 1 of each, unless you don't like figs, of course. Sometimes the figs on the early 2-crop will drop, and sometimes the figs late on the 2-crop will get moldy from the rain. But again, the last few years that has not been a problem. Figs dry wonderfully too. I don't dry them whole. I split them in half and dry them, but they dry amazingly well. I'm drying fruit in the windshield of the car right now. One of the fruits that is the most difficult to grow for a home gardener used to be peaches, because peaches required spray every 6 times during the winter. Sometimes it would be 7 times after a period where it hadn't rained and it was going to be dry for 4 days, which is difficult to find. And it's quite a setup. In a commercial orchard, you've got a big spray machine, but there are now resistant peaches. Frost was the earliest curl resistant peach, and it gives you a good big crop. It's a little more of a tart peach in my tasting, and Oregon Curl Free was the next one, and there are other varieties out there now too. But the Oregon Curl Free tends to be sweeter, and the frost it has a little tartar of a taste. One of the things I like about both these peaches, though, is they have about a month-long ripening period. So you'll get 10 or 20 peaches a day for almost a month as your trees get older, and peaches grow and start to produce fruit very quickly. So if you put a peach tree in the spring, you'll likely get peaches the second year, and by the third year, you'll be giving people peaches. There are some problems. Late frost can kill the blossoms because they'll tend to blossom very early. Now, I've written this in here because my peaches occasionally bloom in January or early February, but I've never lost the crop because of that. I think it's more if it's raining really hard, they don't get well pollinated. If you wish you could spray sulfur, you are still allowed to spray sulfur even on the resistant varieties. It's just you don't have to. And I have heard from people, it hasn't occurred for me, that sometimes those resistant varieties will get curl for a while, and that if you spray them a little with sulfur in the early couple of years, that it'll be better. I personally have not run into that, but I've heard that reported from a couple of different people. A new one that has just come on is the curl-resistant nectarine, and I planted a couple of these. It must be about 3 or 4 years ago, and we picked 70 pounds of nectarines this year. Now, I think some of that was the weather because I'd had little fruit on it. It hadn't ripened as well. They weren't huge, but they are just incredibly tasty. I've dried a bunch of them. I've made them into fruit leather. So nectarines is a new thing, and I believe there's at least 2 curl-resistant varieties. The catalog from One Green World will tell you, and there are other places too to look, but they'll tell you whether it's a resistant variety or not. And again, if I didn't have an orchard and the capacity to spray and the desire to have some of the older peaches like Alberta's, I would not plant anything but resistant because it's otherwise a fruit that's just easy to grow and doesn't have a lot of problems. Kiwis. We're not going to eat kiwis as the bird on the left, and that's my family who lives in New Zealand on the right. We're going to talk about kiwi fruit, and I prefer the fuzzy Hayward because you pick them in October, put them in egg cartons or boxes. Sometimes I have 1,000 of them, and they start to ripen in January, and they continue to ripen this year through May. So you're eating fruit that came from your yard January through May, which is the period of time we don't have fruit from any other source. You do need to keep pruning them, even in the summer. They are not, by the way, from New Zealand. They're from China, and they do need to be watered during the summer. Not a huge amount. I probably give mine 40 gallons a month during the summer months. So I have pretty wet soil, or I live in an area with pretty good soil moisture, but they're not as drought tolerant as some of the other fruit trees. You have to keep them pruned. Even in the summer, you'll get long 20-foot vines that come up, and you have to keep them pruned or they'll take over the apple tree next door or just take over the whole plant. And as far as pests go, I have squirrels. They'll try a few of them, chew a few bites, and then realize they're no good, as they do with almost everything. But they are a remarkable crop. You can also get the hardy kiwi. The reason I don't grow those is because they ripen at the end of summer when every other fruit in the world is ripe, and I prefer the flavor of the fuzzy Hayward, which is that nice winter eating fruit. So I think that's really important to me anyway. Persimmons grow really well here. I do not have a persimmon tree. They're beautiful. I wish I had a friend with a persimmon tree, and maybe after I say this out loud, I will. My mother-in-law liked the soft, snotty ones. Oops, did I say snotty? I mean slimy ones. And if you put them in the freezer, they turn it into a lovely sorbet without any other work. Other people like the more firm, fleshed ones. The critters, like raccoons, sometimes do like to eat them, and they tend to ripen in a glut so that you suddenly have a whole bunch of persimmons, which either means freezing them or eating a lot of persimmons for a while. But it's another fruit that's just beautiful, that does well here and really doesn't have very many pests, with the exception sometimes of raccoons. Grapes used to be powdery mildew nightmare, and it's still a problem. I have some mildew resistant grapes that aren't as resistant as I wish they were, so I do have to spray them with sulfur. But Grapes do really well here. That's why we have so many wineries. And if you don't water them real late into the season, they'll start to be sweeter and be less likely to crack. You'll have a little balance there. And the powdery mildew, some years I don't have a big problem. I have friends with no problems, but this year I happen to have a bit of problem. So I'll try spraying with sulfur next year, at least a little bit, or I'll do it on half of the vines. And it's fun to experiment a little bit and see if your mildew problem can be solved with sulfur or if it's something that's not easily solved. So experimenting is always a good thing to do when you're growing fruit. There are so many berries that do well in Oregon that I only put 4 squares up here. But with the exception of a few things like the spotted winged Drosophila and of course strawberries getting slug damage and squirrels stealing them, there are few berries that won't do well here. I recently, 5 years ago, got some thornless blackberries that have not only the attribute of no thorns, not like the thornless raspberries, which will still hurt you. The thornless blackberries, you can hug them and kiss them, and they won't hurt you at all because they don't have any thorns. But the thornless blackberries that I have, they tend to be sweeter, and they grow in a clump and only spread out if their tip touches the ground somewhere. So that makes them easier to keep controlled as opposed to raspberries, which, given an opportunity, will take over your entire yard and maybe the entire city. The blackberries, the new thornless ones, only grow from the tips, and it's kind of a nice way to keep them confined a little bit. Blueberries do have some problems, birds like them, but they also have the advantage of having a long season. If you plant different kinds of blueberries, you can have a crop for a long time. I am not very successful with blueberries because they need regular watering, and I'm trying to start backing off on the things that need more water than is naturally falling in Oregon. But if you've got the water source and the willingness to keep them damp, they like to have their feet damp for a nice stretched out fruit crop. Now I want to talk a little bit about pears and apples because everybody loves pears and apples, except well, not only do we love them, so do codling moths and apple maggots. Moths, they get scab, they get the maggots, and then they get the codling moth. And there are ways to stop that, and I'll show you what I tend to do. But the maggots or the codling moth in the apple or pear makes them impossible to store. So you have to use them now. And it's almost impossible to keep them off without a really, really strict spray program, even organically. It's a once a week program from my understanding. So there are a few things that you can do. You can get rid of some of the diseases by using disease-resistant varieties. That's pretty simple and straightforward. But you can also use early varieties. So my yellow transparent and lodi and even the Gravenstein, which comes on pretty early, don't tend to get either the codling moth or the apple maggot, which didn't used to exist in Oregon until relatively recently, I guess 20 years now, recent to me. But those early varieties have much less damage. I have some other apple varieties, one that I love that's in my neighbor's yard that leans over the fence, and it doesn't ripen until about October, and it is always just a wormy disaster if you don't do some protection of it, which I'll show you in a second. Asian pears don't seem to get the maggot, and my experience, yours may be different, is that the ones that get a codling moth in them will drop off the tree, and it kind of self-thins a little bit, and I end up with most of the pears that are on the tree, or at least the majority of them, don't have an insect pest. They don't keep very well, so they have to be eaten anyway, but they do dry well. I'm drying some Asian pears right now, and they're amazing. The other pears that people ignore are all the different winter pears. If you have a pear in your yard and it was there when you got here, it's a Bartlett pear. And you'll pick those. Oh, I picked those about 3 weeks ago, and I'm just drying the last of them. With all pears, I should mention this because I just passed somebody today and gave this. You pick pears by lifting up on the fruit And if the fruit comes off of the tree, it's ready to pick. If you let them ripen on the tree, they'll either fall off on their own and get bruised and try to ripen on the ground, or they get mushy. So I don't know how people discovered this, but you pick the pear, put it in a box somewhere. If it's a Bartlett, you can just put them in a box in the garage or in a coolish place, and they'll ripen up within 5 to 10 days usually, and then you can deal with them as far as drying them or eating them fresh or canning them. But the winter pears, all the others, the Danjou, the Comice, the Bosque, need to be refrigerated for a time before they will ripen properly. And that's why maybe you've seen Harry and David sends pears to people in December. Well, they pick those in October or September perhaps, and then they put them into cold storage, and you take them out of the refrigerator just at the right time so that when they arrive for the gift, they're ripe. Well, you can do the same thing. And if you don't chill your winter pears, they generally don't ripen as well. So come the end of the season, we're a one refrigerator family. It is about a third full of pears stuffed in the back, because I have a Comice, I have about 4 different winter pear varieties too, and I really appreciate the fact that they'll ripen when you take them out of the refrigerator. And so last year we ate pears from the fridge through the early part of March, almost made it to when the Kiwis were in their time, or I guess we had shared fruit. So here are some of the things that you can do to make your apples and your pears not have pests in them. The simplest one that I do is you put footies on them. These are little nylon stockings, and prior to putting the footy on them, I'll see if that's the right slide next, but prior to it, just in case it's not, I pour what's called surround kaolin clay, mix a cup of it in 2 quarts of water, and pour it back and forth through the footies, and it will get lodged in the nylon mesh. And that kaolin clay is one of the organic tools that growers use to keep the codling moth out of their fruit in the first place, because it's kind of gray. I'll show you a picture in a second. But the combination of a footy and the kaolin clay has been the best for me. Other people in a lot of other countries, they'll put paper bags on their fruit, and that can keep all the critters out of it. On the trees that I have here, you can see on the right, I have a footy that had the clay in it. And I'll show you a picture of the clay sprayed in a second. Another thing that's important to do if you can is put your bag on and then pick off some of the other fruit, as opposed to picking all the fruit off first, thinning it, and then putting the bag on, because then you'll knock off that piece of fruit while you're putting the bag on. When I first started bagging fruit, it seemed absurd. It would take me 5 minutes to tie one bag on, and now I can put on 4 or 5 bags in a minute. And you don't have to be so fussy tying them on. I just use the bag itself and tie a little knot in it, because the critters, the codling moth and the apple maggots, tend to be coming in at the flower end. So that's well covered up by the footy. I use them 2 times, especially on trees that I described, the neighbor tree that the critters really like, that the codling moths really like. I put 2 footies on each apple in order to get a good apple from that tree. If you don't do that, if you only put on 1, you might get a good apple. If you don't put anything on, you will not get any good apples. So you'll experiment. How much protection do you need to get your fruit pest free? Other people use plastic bags, and I would guess you maybe could use those over. On the picture on the right, that is just the clay, kaolin clay, which is edible, and it's even used as a dietary supplement by some people. That's the kaolin clay, and it just mixes with water and sprays on the fruit, and you can wash it off before you eat it, but you wouldn't even have to if you didn't want to. But apparently it confuses the animal, because the apple doesn't look like an apple, and they don't like eating through that. I have a 40-pound bag of kaolin clay that I bought many years ago that I share, and I will bring some of that clay to the extension office. And if a smart man would do that in the spring, but I'll let Jet tell me when I'm going to do that, because I bought this 40-pound bag for $13 and a 2-pound box was $9 or something. And I did this purposely. I've shared it with many people over the years, but I'll make sure that we get some to the extension service somehow so that you can try this and see if you like the clay technique before you make the purchase of your own 40 pounds to share with friends. If you don't do something to protect your fruit, this is kind of a rough graph, you'll get problems. But the real key here is if you look to the far right, defect-free apples bagged run to about 80%, and defect-free apples unbagged are around 7%. So it's not perfect. You will have somebody eat through that bag once in a while, and you look at it and go, how did you do this? But because they were hungry, I guess. But it does get rid of some of the other things. I mean, fly speck isn't that big of a deal. It just washes off. But the flies can't get at your apple that way. I don't know what sooty blotch is, but it appears to be well controlled by, oh no, I don't need it to control it. Anyway, whatever sooty blotch is, but on all the other critters, boy, it really, really makes a difference. Now I'll show you pictures of saying what I just told you, but that's okay. Repetition is probably a good thing. You know, I mix that clay in the water, about a cup, or maybe even only a half a cup, and then you pour it through the footies that you can get online or maybe go to a shoe store and beg. But I pour it through and have a bowl that catches it. I'll put the footies into a colander so that the water goes through, and you'll be surprised as you pour it through about 10 times, all of a sudden your white clay water will just be ever so slightly clay colored, and you'll know you're done because the clay gets lodged into the fibers of the footy. I already talked about picking pears, but here's some more pictures that will remind us to do what I already said we should do. And again, that's pick them when you lift them and they come off, and then put them in the fridge for a period of time. So I'm just starting to get some pears in my fridge. It's a little late, I'm sure, for anybody who doesn't live like up in the mountains for your Bartlett pears. But if you pick a Bartlett pear and put it in the fridge, you can also keep it for quite a while. I mean, 6 weeks or so. So one of the disadvantages of pears, as opposed to the peaches that I was describing earlier, is that they come on pretty much all at once. So suddenly you have, in this case, I had 200 pounds of pears, I'm sure. Some friends got a lot of pears. I've dried a lot of pears. But I also have 20 pounds in the fridge so that I can be taking those out as fall continues. We like to have fruit on our breakfast a lot. So I'll be able to keep the pears ripening that way by taking them out slowly. So the Bartlett can be preserved that same way. Again, they don't need any chill. The others need 4 to 6 weeks of chill. And I always wonder, who discovered this? How did they figure this out? Picked some pears and said, I got an idea, honey. Let's put them in the refrigerator for 6 weeks and see if they taste better later. Sure enough, they do. There's some other things you can do to reduce the amount of damage you're going to have in the first place. Thinning your fruit so that it's about 6 inches from every other piece of fruit will give you bigger fruit and fewer ways for the critters to get from fruit to fruit. Anytime you have 2 apples touching, the codling moth is pretty shy. They will crawl from one apple right into the other one so they don't have to be exposed to being seen by a bird or something of that sort. So anytime you have touching fruit, assuming you have plenty, remove it. I write clean up your windfalls there, but if you have 50 apple trees like I do, sometimes that's not easy. And another thing that you can do is if you have damaged fruit, just remove it so the tree isn't putting so much energy in. You can put it into your composter because the fruit that's damaged will not heal. Once that codling moth is in there, it's too late. It's not going to heal and become a storable fruit. I don't grow certain fruits because there are problems with them. My parents had a cherry orchard, and we were legally required to spray the cherries for the cherry fruit fly. If you don't spray your cherries and you open them up, pretty much every cherry will have a worm in it. Now, that's not bad. If you eat them quickly enough, they'll be fine, and they'll taste fine. And I'm not going to play the, oh, a little protein isn't bad for you game, because I don't want to eat worms, but you won't notice the little worm. But once they're more mature, I find they start making the cherries taste bad. I have a raccoon issue and a bird issue, so I just don't get any cherries despite the fact that I have a cherry tree. So it's one of the reasons that I don't grow cherries, but I have friends who have great cherries. They do get a worm in them, that's okay, and so by all means grow a cherry. Uh, there are other critters that will mess with your fruit. I mentioned raccoons. No matter how cute they look, they'll eat some of the fruit, and I really should put a picture of a squirrel up here because I have a major squirrel infestation. I have two neighbors who feed squirrels, and I've encouraged them not to, but we have a lot of squirrels in the yard, so they come in and they try each piece of fruit just to see if it's ready yet. And what they do is they take one bite out, go, oh, it's not ready, throw it on the ground, go to the next fruit. This year, because we had such a big fruit crop, maybe they did me a favor by thinning it, but they can be a problem. Now, I put the cat in there because cats will scratch to mark their territory on small trees, or in this case, this was a kiwi plant, and so they'll scratch it, and once the tree is mature, it can tolerate that marking. But when it's a little tree, you just put in this little 2-year-old tree, it can really damage the tree. So I wrap the base of the tree with something. That left side happens to be the webbing that you can put, I believe, on gutters to keep the leaves out. It doesn't work. That's why it's wrapped around that tree instead. But you can get a commercial product too, as you see on the right. But otherwise, you may not. Maybe your neighbors don't let the cats wander, but they'll damage things in a way that may slow down the tree, but it'll certainly slow it down. Pruning freaks people out. They think it's going to be hard, but it's not that hard. And the real key is you can't blow it except for one thing, which I'll tell you about in just a second. So I would like to prune in the late winter, but if you go to a commercial orchard, the day they pick the last apple, they're starting to prune because there isn't time to wait until February 15th to start the pruning. But I prefer doing it in late winter, and there are a few little exceptions. You get to decide what your tree is going to look like. I like the vase or vase because I can climb up in there and pick. If you have a small yard, you might go with a central leader. There are some lovely columnar, they're shaped like a column, apples, and I think pears now too. I don't know about other fruits, but if you have a really small space, they grow, they never get more than about 4 feet wide, and they produce a lot of fruit, and they are quite a lovely tree. They still get, coddling moths and maggots and that sort of thing. You can use the central leader. Some people modify, but I prefer the vase and multiple leader. Just it fits my style. So that first year, you just cut the tree off where you want it to branch out. Now you'll get several branches, and you can start using those as either your new leader, so you can get a upright tree with a lot of branches, or you can turn it into the vase or what you have. There's a little bit about the trees that you don't want to prune off. The fruit spurs for next year are growing already this year on some of the trees that I'll describe in a second. So if you over prune, especially apples and pears, you can have no fruit the next year because you've cut off all the wood that would produce fruit. So apples and pears produce on wood that grew the year before this. Next year, they'll grow on the wood that grew last year. So if you prune all that wood off, you'll never get any fruit. Look for the fruit spurs. Don't cut them all off. Start a little slow, and you'll not over prune them. Peaches for next year are going to be on wood that grew this year. So that makes things pretty simple. Plums and prunes generally are on first year wood, and all of the trees can also grow fruit on older wood, but apples need it at least 2 years old. The wood that's growing this year on your apple will not produce fruit next year. So that's really the only problem with pruning. Otherwise, just prune them the way that you want them to look because it's your yard. I tend to now, as I get older, I prune things lower and lower because I don't want to fall out of a ladder. Some things are easy to prune. On the left is a grape that hasn't been pruned. On the right is that same grape. Unfortunately, not quite the same shot, pruned, but I've got 8 2-foot pieces with 2 buds per piece. A vintner would only put probably 2 shoots on there, but I've found sometimes one of them will break off, so I leave a little more than I should, but there's a very, very tiny bit of the grape left because all the grapes grow on the wood that grows during the summer. So the grape grows on this year's wood. If you're going to make an arbor or something, you'll have to leave some of those pieces to go up onto the arbor, but then all the grapes are going to grow on the wood that grows that year, so you'll have to prune it that way. Kiwi pruning is constant and requires a lot. I tend to try to leave the pieces that look like arthritic fingers on there because that's where the new fruit will grow. It won't grow on all those amazing, long, dangling vines that kiwi fruit produce. One of the other problems you're going to have is too much fruit. So I dry a ridiculous amount of fruit, but it's so wonderful to have it all winter long. And I make a lot of fruit leather, and fruit leather sells big with kids. To make fruit leather out of prunes, for example, or out of peaches, I made a bunch of nectarine fruit leather this year. Pear, I don't make it get a little graininess to it, but I made a lot of peach pear fruit leather this year. You bring the fruit to a boil. The pears, of course, you have to core them, and the peaches, you have to take the pits out. You bring it to a boil or blend it up in the blender, bring it to a boil, and then pour it onto cookie sheets. And I dry it out in the sun for the most part, and I do, again, dry a lot of stuff on the roof. But right now I have a bunch of fruit drying in the car because if it's windy, it blows branches down or blows little pieces of tree down into it, and I don't want all that stuff in my fruit leather. Once you've dried it, I tend to store it in a jar, and I'll put it in the oven at 200 degrees for an hour just to make sure there's no mold. I over dry my fruit because I don't want it to mold, but it's an easy way to get rid of it, or to store it. I didn't mean get rid of it. There's a bunch of peaches and a bunch of pears that are drying. Fruit flies are a problem. There's a couple of traps. I like a little water and vinegar and soap, and then I like this cone trap on the right. They'll fly down into the cone, and if you want to let them go, you can by taking it outside. But keeping them trapped a little bit is a good idea. You'll have too much fruit. That's a kiwi blueberry pie. Can you see the waffle that's hidden under this breakfast fruit menagerie? Of course you can, but it's fun to put fruit on almost anything and everything. And I finally changed the address to the right address for the Master Gardener people, but these are places to think about getting fruit. One Green World has a great variety, so does a great variety of types, a variety of varieties, that's what I mean to say. The Extension Service, of course, is a wonderful source of information about which kinds of fruit will grow here and whether it will do well and whether it's resistant, etc., etc. Google is not a bad thing. Watch out if it's only going to sell you fruit no matter where it's from. And then I talk about this. Ask your neighbors or the store clerk or anybody who grows fruit which ones do well. And you're going to ask them this for 2 reasons. If your neighbor already has a Bartlett pear, you probably don't need to plant a Bartlett pear unless you don't like your neighbor. You can share that fruit and you could plant a winter pear. So lots of places to get information about how to grow fruit, but asking around what works is probably a good idea. I have a website that doesn't sell anything, recycle-weather.com, that has this fruit talk, and it's going to be on the Extension Service website too. But there's some other things there too about like how to dry fruit and all. So that's another place you can see these things if you so choose. Now I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I was going to talk about cover crops briefly. That'll take 10 minutes is all. Should I try to answer a question if there is one first, or should I just do the other piece?
Okay.
Okay, so I'm going to go to it and see if I can get it up there. And there we go. Here's cover crops. Oh, where's slideshow? It's F which is slideshow because my you remember which is slideshow to our technical person, because all the
Down, take your cursor down, up, it's right up next to animations, between animations and review, up along this, your top line there. John, can you?
F5.
see it's covered up with the it's covered
F5,
up
John.
with F5. Okay.
Yay.
Why don't I have F keys? Oh goodness. I don't have the, oh, I see, there they are, okay. 5, there we go. See, unfortunately, what's happened here is I'm covered up with the,
so you're on home now, go all the way to your right,
yeah.
Go to your right, keep going
Yeah.
past animation, keep going, slide over, take your cursor and move it over to the right, keep
Yeah,
going.
it's underneath the zoom stuff, see? Oh,
Ooh,
there we go. Okay, I could move, I didn't know I could move the zoom stuff.
go, click.
And now I am doing so, and now I'm going to be
From the beginning.
I'm going to be semi-professional soon. There we go. Okay, so if your garden is done for the season, you don't want it to just sit there and be a mud pie all winter. And cover crops are a wonderful way to both reduce weeds that would grow all winter, to protect the soil from the rain, and even more important, of course, is to enhance the fertility of the soil and add organic matter. My favorite here is the crimson clover, because it attracts so many lovely bees, and when you mow it down, it's very docile. It doesn't try to come back. So cover crops are a great thing to do. As I mentioned already, they fix nitrogen and add that biomass. There are a few that don't fix nitrogen that I don't bother with, but people have grown annual ryegrass as a cover crop, and I did once because I try to experiment, but I'm never going to do that experiment again. So fava beans, vetch, corn salad isn't a fixer, but it does give you a lot of quick material. You have to cut the clover when it's blooming, or you could cut it even earlier, but it's just a shame to miss all those lovely crimson blossoms. Crimson clover, not red clover. Crimson. Red clover is a perennial and will keep coming back, but the crimson clover will give up when it gets disturbed. But you have to do it early in the morning because the bees love it and they will chase you out of that clover patch. So here's a spot where I cut the clover down. I believe I used a lawn mower here, but you can use a weed whacker, or you can even just use a set of pruners if you want to. And then what I'm going to do to plant, though, is not try to turn that in. You always hear people say, oh, just turn that crop in. The clover was 3 feet high. There's a huge mass of organic matter there. You're never going to be able to turn it in and have it degrade. So I push it off to the sides and use it as mulch. And in this case, I'm going to plant corn in here. I did put some cottonseed meal or some soybean meal in there, I think, too. But you've now got a spot in your cover crop area that was fertilized, and now it's mulched to protect the moisture in there. And it's the simplest way to do things. And over the course of the summer, that material will degrade and work its way into the soil. Again, with the vetch, it's a great bunch of organic matter, but you can't turn it in. You can either smash it down, as I did. Vetch doesn't give up quite as easily, or you can use it as part of a compost of your own. Fava beans are by far my favorite cover crop because they're more than just a cover crop. They're an edible crop too. And I am going to bring some fava beans. I saved a bunch of them just for this reason. So I'll bring those down to the extension office, and the Magic Jet will also tell you how you can get them. But I've got probably, I don't know, I've got four pounds of them that I'll bring down there. If you feel like you don't want to take more than you need, but you can take 40 fava bean seeds and have a pretty good crop. You can then save your own seeds too. And because I've been doing this cover crop thing with my favas for a long time, I only save the seeds of the plants that survive. And these seeds survived our 2 days of 10 below zero a few years ago. And I've seen a noticeable change in my favas over the 25 years I've been doing this in their ability to withstand cold. Now, I mentioned that the favas are a cover crop for numerous reasons. I just planted mine, so they're not out there yet. This is a picture from when I should have planted them. But typically, I would plant them in late August in a spot that I dug up potatoes or something of that sort, and they'd be up a little bit now. I just put them in, but they'll be up soon enough. But what's nice is that the greens from the fava are a good addition to salads all winter long. Once they start blooming, their taste changes a little bit. If you're desperate for salad, they're still fine, but they provide green all summer long. And I mentioned that they're very frost resistant in this picture that's 20 degrees outside, and they look like they're all dead. They're not. Don't pick them for greens when they're frozen, or they'll be all weird and mushy, but they'll come back just fine on their own. They produce a great big podded bean, usually starting in April or May, depending on the winter. You have to shell the beans out of that pod, and you eat the bean on the right. If you go in a cookbook that came from France, if you look for a recipe, they'll say that you have to shell the shelled beans one more time and take the little teeny piece out of that. Don't look in a French cookbook. Look in a Portuguese cookbook, and they will tell you you don't need to do that. But if you just shell them and steam them, they're really good. We made a bunch of what is that? Hummus. I made a bunch of hummus out of beans this year. That was good because anything is good if you dip a chip in it, right? But the fava beans are really the most prolific cover crop you can get, and you can turn them down anytime and either use them as a laid down mulch, but ideally you'll at least let some of them go fully to seed so you can save seed, and of course so you can eat the beans in the spring. I don't find dried cooked favas as palatable as I like them fresh before they've fully matured. It's the Windsor Broad that you're going to plant. The Windsor Broad. Vetch and buckwheat are good. Crimson clover, not red clover, as I mentioned. This is an interesting thing to me that it's not really a cover crop, but it's a crop that's appropriate here. This happens to be a winter wheat. This is a red wheat, if I recall correctly. And the original agriculture in the Willamette Valley was greatly limited by the lack of summer water. So winter wheats and fava beans and things of that sort do fine on just the moisture that we get during the winter months, and then they're pretty much done with their life cycle once we get into our long summer drought. So there's some ecological benefits to them too. The favas, you really don't need to water except a little in August and September to get them up. You could until it got wet. In even October, November, I've planted some seeds I found once in January, and they did just fine. They popped up and came up just fine, even in January. But these plants can use the natural water, and I think that's kind of an advantage. So that's it for cover crops. I'm going to bring some fava beans down to the extension service. I think it'll be on Wednesday. I'm going to bring them in case you're listening down there, Jet, because I'm in that neighborhood then. Some of the fava beans that I bring have little holes in them because there's a little beetle that gets in. I've put them in the freezer, and it tends to kill. It mostly kills the little beetles, and the seeds seem to sprout just fine, even though they've got that little hole in them. But if you get a bunch of them with holes in them, maybe you plant them 6 inches apart instead of a foot apart. The fava plant gets to be about 6. I had them 7 feet tall this year, so it's a substantial plant. And if you plant them too close together, the middle of the batch won't produce much in the way of bean because all I can do is grow up to try to find some sunshine among all the other favas. So I'd say put them a foot apart and in rows, at least a foot apart. If you're trying to keep weeds down, a foot by a foot is good. If you're trying to get more of a bean harvest, I would even put the rows 2 feet apart but you might need to mulch between them in order to keep the weeds down that way. So now I think I can stop sharing, and if anybody has a question that I could answer in
Thank you,
5
John.
minutes.
That was great. And
Okay.
Helen's going to do your Q&A, but I wanted to say to everybody to listen to John's. John does the talk on good gardening for KLCC. So if you want to hear more of his wonderful wisdom of gardening, that's another place to find it. Thank you, John.
And it's blessedly only 2 minutes long.
Oh, that was great, John. So much information, and we had questions right from the beginning. First question is, can you grow figs in pots?
I have friends who grow figs in pots. They don't get as many figs, and you must assure that if it gets really cold, that you protect the pot sufficiently that the root ball does not freeze. But yes, you can if you have no other space, but you're doing a fig on a deck. You won't get as many figs, but it's a lovely plant, but don't let it freeze. And when we get one of those unusual 15 degrees, you got to wrap it with a blanket and put a drop light or something in there with it.
Ah, okay. Another question from Martha. Which fruit is best to bag or clay up? Apples and certain pears?
Every apple and every pear needs that protection to reduce, not eliminate, but greatly reduce the numbers of codling moths and apple maggots. And I forgot to say, you should do it when they're about the size of the end of your thumb. And you should probably trim your thumbnail more frequently than I have been. But about that size, that's when you put your bag on and the bag will expand. But without a bag or clay, they'll all get the codling moth. You don't need any of those things for plums, for peaches, for nectarines, for kiwi fruit, for figs, or for persimmons. So that's strictly for apples and pears.
So it sounds like apples are a lot of work.
They are, but they're a wonderful fruit. You know, they have a lot of wonderful advantages, but they are more work, yes.
And these are for eating apples as opposed to just, cutting them out for sauce and other things.
Oh, sure. And so if you're willing to cut out the codling moth, you'll have a lot of apple left. It's just they won't store at all. And some people are fussy and they won't eat an apple with a little worm in it. The maggot is a different critter. It runs around inside the apple and makes little tracks and leaves its feces behind, and the entire apple is no good if you have maggots in it.
Question, can you freeze fava beans?
Yes, and so what I do is I steam them for 2 minutes and put them on a tray in the freezer, and then we have them all winter, and we probably have 20 pounds. And when I say we, I think I mean me and my wife. We do a lot of this together. But yes, they freeze beautifully. And then you can bring them up.
So you blanch them.
Yeah, just blanch them. And you can find on the Master Food Preserver website how long to blanch different things. But you pod them first. You take them out of the pods first.
Bonnie wants to know, which apricot would you recommend?
None. I've had zero success, but there's about 3 of them in the Northwest that apparently will grow, but I have had zero success. So I cannot personally recommend one. I go to One Green World and look, and I'd go to the Extension Service because there are several out there. I have 100 fruit trees in the backyard. My family in LeGrand, apricots grow like they don't know what to do with them. So I have given up on apricots. But they supposedly will do okay here if you get the right variety.
So right plant, right place.
I guess. I just haven't found it, and I got a 3/4 of an acre. Wouldn't you think I could find the right place on here somewhere? But I have not found it, so.
Okay. Yeah, how about Julie is saying, I'm getting crabgrass in my vegetable garden this year. This is new. How can I avoid this next year? No, if you talked about crabgrass.
No, I didn't.
You don't have it.
I don't blame you. Oh, I got it. I'm a big cardboard mulch guy. I put cardboard mulch down, and that helps reduce it. But crabgrass is part of life.
Okay, that's a philosophical answer.
Yes, and it wasn't part of
Yes.
this talk, so I'm not going to go there.
Yes, okay. Well, Julie said, what about grafting different varieties to one fruit tree, like
Yes.
apple or plum?
Yes, I've done a lot of grafting. My orchard in the backyard that has, gosh, 30 different kinds of apples. I grafted them all as part of this big grafting project, and so it's very easy to graft different fruit trees onto a single rootstock. Once you have the tree, you can go and get scion wood from somebody, and I'm not going to explain grafting here, but it's not that complicated. But the thing I would suggest is put 3 of each scion on when you graft it on, and that way if only one of them takes, you still have one, and if all 3 take, you can either trim them off, and then remember where your graft is and mark it, because otherwise you're going to be pruning later on, and I've seen this happen, and you'll prune off the entire branch that has the graft on it or something of that sort. But pears and apples can easily have numerous fruits on them. It makes picking more complicated because this apple isn't even close to ripe and this one is overripe. But it's a fun thing to do, and grafting is it's pretty simple. Just practice, you'll get better at it.
So that really makes your yard more versatile if you can have different varieties on one tree. If you have
Yeah,
a
certainly.
smaller, yes.
Right, I always forget small yard. I have 3/4 of an acre and it's mostly in production of food, and so I don't have a small yard. Sometimes I wish I did.
I have a question in that I went to pick up fava beans and they had field fava beans versus the other fava beans.
Right,
And
so the field fava is a great nitrogen fixer, and it is edible, but it'll give you a little bean about the size of the end of my pinky, and the Windsor Broad, will be the size of my thumb. And I'm going to bring those seeds in on Wednesday, and there's several thousand seeds. You deserve some for the extra work you've been doing if you can't find them anywhere else. But it's the Windsor Broad if you want to eat them. And the field fava is great for cover crop.
is good for a cover crop. Okay, because
Yes.
that the price difference between the field fava and the Windsor Broad or the other ones was like $6 a pound. But if you bring us some, then it reduces the cost all the way around.
Right, and then everybody can share the seeds with their friends, and eventually.
Right. Well, I don't see any more questions and we're at 2:59 here, so I'm going to turn it back to Gwendolyn, and thank you so much.
Sure, it was fun. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John.